American bomber crews had a tradition that seemed completely insane to military command, painting pin-up girls and cartoon characters on multi-million-dollar aircraft heading into combat. One cold morning in March 1943, with a few cans of paint and a magazine clipping, they created what would become the most famous bomber in history. Second Lieutenant Robert Morgan stood before his pristine B-17 Flying Fortress with paint supplies and a vision of his girlfriend back home. "We're calling her Memphis Belle," he told his crew, "and she's getting the prettiest girl in the sky painted on her nose." His commanding officer thought he'd lost his mind, but the story of why they did it and what effect it had reveals something profound about survival psychology, superstition under fire, and the desperate human need for control in the face of random death. What started as a morale-boosting gesture by a handful of terrified young men would become one of the most powerful psychological tools of the entire air war. The practice of nose art didn't emerge suddenly in World War II. It had roots stretching back to the First World War, when pilots began marking their aircraft with personal symbols. French aces painted elaborate designs on their fighters. German pilots added distinctive markings. British squadrons developed a unique insignia. These early aviators were creating individual identity in the faceless machinery of industrialized warfare. But World War I nose art remained limited. Aircraft were small fabric-covered biplanes with restricted surface area. Paintings were modest, often just squadron badges or simple personal symbols. Military regulations discouraged excessive personalization. The tradition existed but remained confined to small-scale individual expression. World War II transformed everything about aerial warfare, including nose art. The scale was unprecedented. Thousands upon thousands of aircraft, hundreds of thousands of young men, most barely past their teenage years, facing statistical probabilities of death that were absolutely terrifying. American bomber crews flying missions over Europe faced approximately 25% odds of being killed or captured during their required tour of duty. Fighter pilots in every theater faced similar mortality rates. These weren't career military professionals. They were civilians given uniforms, a few months of training, and orders to fight the most technologically advanced war humanity had ever seen. Farm boys from Iowa, college students from California, factory workers from Detroit, young men who should have been starting careers or families were instead climbing into bombers and fighters, knowing that every mission might be their last. The psychological pressure was crushing. Technical Sergeant James O'Brien, a ball turret gunner on a B-24 Liberator, captured this existential dread in his diary entries. Every mission felt like gambling with death. The waiting between missions was worse than combat itself. Sitting in England during those long hours before takeoff, counting down the minutes, knowing the statistics, understanding that mathematically your luck would eventually run out. In this environment of sustained psychological terror, nose art emerged as far more than simple decoration. It became a crucial survival mechanism for maintaining sanity in insane circumstances. Stay with me. We're about to reveal how something as simple as paint became a lifeline for thousands of young men facing death. The first and most immediate function of nose art was creating identity in a world of mechanical anonymity. The American Air Forces operated thousands of identical bombers. B-17 Flying Fortresses rolled off assembly lines by the hundreds, each one virtually indistinguishable from the next. To the military bureaucracy, they were just numbers. Aircraft serial number 42-30127 meant nothing human. Captain Charles Henderson, who piloted B-17s with the 303rd Bomb Group, explained the transformation that occurred through naming and painting. When you're first assigned to a bomber, it's just equipment, a number on a form. Nothing about that number creates any emotional connection. But when you name that aircraft, when you paint something meaningful on the nose, suddenly everything changes. It's not military equipment anymore. It becomes your aircraft, your home in the sky, the machine where you and your crew will live or die together. This sense of personal ownership created powerful psychological bonds. Bomber crews didn't just fly their aircraft, they inhabited them. A typical B-17 mission to Germany lasted 10 to 12 hours. The bomber was cramped, freezing cold at altitude, constantly vibrating, filled with the roar of engines and the smell of fuel and oil. but it was theirs. The nose art made it recognizable among thousands of identical machines. It gave their aircraft personality, character, individuality. The names reflected deeply personal connections. Many bombers were named after girlfriends, wives, mothers. Memphis Belle honored Robert Morgan's sweetheart Margaret Polk from Memphis. Sentimental Journey evoked longing for home. My Gal Sal represented another pilot's beloved. These weren't generic names. They were intensely personal tributes to the people crews hoped to return to. Other names referenced home locations: Spokane's Little Joe, Alabama Exterminator, California Dreamin'. The names kept crews psychologically connected to places thousands of miles away, places that represented everything they were fighting to preserve and return to. Some names were aggressively defiant: Hell's Angels, Murder Incorporated Destiny's Tots. These reflected a different psychological strategy, embracing the violence and danger rather than seeking comfort in nostalgia. The aggression in these names was a form of psychological armor, a way of claiming power in powerless circumstances. The artwork accompanying these names was equally personal. Pin-up girls dominated, usually inspired by contemporary magazine illustrations. Cartoon characters appeared frequently, from Disney figures to newspaper comic strip personalities. Some aircraft featured fierce animals, skulls, devils, or abstract designs. Each choice reflected the crew's collective personality and psychological needs. But there was something deeper operating beneath this surface personalization, something about magical thinking and the desperate human need to create control where none existed. Don't go anywhere. We're about to explore the superstitious rituals that kept men alive, at least in their own minds. World War II aircrews were among the most superstitious people in military history, and they had excellent reasons for this. They faced random death on every mission. Human psychology cannot function in situations of pure randomness without creating systems of perceived control, even when those systems are completely illusory. Nose art became integral to elaborate superstitious rituals. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a fighter ace flying P-47 Thunderbolts in Europe, described his pre-mission routine. Before every single mission, without exception, he touched the painted name on his fighter's nose, every time. If circumstances prevented this ritual, he felt psychologically wrong throughout the entire mission. Other pilots had different rituals. Some kissed the nose art, some saluted it, some whispered to it like a living thing. These rituals sound absurd from outside perspective, but they served crucial psychological functions. Combat flying involved confronting mortality in ways that violated every human instinct for self-preservation. Normal psychological coping mechanisms break down under that level of sustained threat. Superstitious rituals provided the illusion of control, and that illusion was psychologically necessary for continued functioning. The belief in lucky aircraft became widespread and powerful. Bombers that survived multiple missions without losing crew members developed reputations as lucky ships. Their nose art became talismanic. Crews believed that flying in these blessed aircraft improved their survival odds. Statistically, this was complete nonsense, but psychologically, it was absolutely crucial. The most famous example was a B-17 named 909. This aircraft completed 140 combat missions without a single crew member being killed. The statistical improbability was remarkable. 909 became legendary throughout the 8th Air Force. Ground crews maintained it with religious devotion. Air crews considered it genuinely blessed. The nose art, featuring a cartoon character called the Little King, became a symbol of invincibility. Men who flew missions in 909 reported feeling safer and more confident. Whether the aircraft actually had any special qualities is irrelevant. The belief that it was lucky had real psychological effects. Pilots flew more aggressively, crews maintained better discipline. The confidence born from superstition translated into measurably better performance. The reverse was equally powerful. Aircraft with unlucky reputations, bombers that had lost crews or suffered repeated serious damage, developed bad reputations that became self-fulfilling. Their nose art became associated with death rather than protection. Crews requested transfers rather than fly in these cursed machines. Some aircraft were eventually scrapped not because of mechanical problems, but because crew morale made them operationally useless. This superstitious thinking extended to specific details of the nose art itself. Certain types of images were considered lucky. Pin-up girls were broadly believed to provide protection, as if feminine beauty could ward off masculine violence. Aggressive animals like tigers or sharks were thought to intimidate fate itself. Religious symbols appeared frequently, prayers painted in aluminum and pigment. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Hang tight. The military brass had strong opinions about all this painting, and their response reveals fascinating tensions between regulation and reality. Military authorities had profoundly complicated relationships with nose art. Officially, explicit regulations existed that should have prevented most of it. Army Air Force regulations specified that aircraft markings should be strictly limited to official insignia, serial numbers, unit designations, and approved squadron symbols. Personal decorations were technically unauthorized modifications to military property. But commanders on the ground, the officers directly responsible for combat operations, recognized the psychological value. They made pragmatic decisions to look the other way. Some actively encouraged nose art despite the regulations. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded bomber groups in England before later leading the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, explicitly authorized nose art for his aircraft. His reasoning was purely tactical. If painting pin-up girls on bombers makes my crews more psychologically resilient and operationally effective, I don't care what peacetime regulations say. My mission is destroying German industrial capacity and bringing my men home alive. If nose art helps accomplish that mission, then nose art becomes tactical equipment as far as I'm concerned. The only restrictions most practical commanders enforced involved obscenity and diplomatic sensitivity. Nose art had to be tasteful enough that it wouldn't cause international incidents when aircraft landed at Allied bases or when photographs appeared in newspapers and magazines back home. This led to interesting negotiations between enthusiastic air crews and cautious commanding officers. Staff Sergeant Anthony Starcer, who painted nose art for dozens of aircraft, recalled the delicate balancing act. Crews would approach him with ideas that were sometimes too sexually explicit for official tolerance. He had to negotiate compromises. They developed techniques for suggesting sexuality without displaying it explicitly. Strategic placement of clothing, clever angles and positioning, implied rather than graphic imagery. It became an art form itself, determining exactly how much suggestiveness could pass official scrutiny. The result was a distinctive visual style. Pin-up girls were the most common motif, but they were painted with enough discretion to satisfy commanders while still serving the psychological functions crews needed. The images were attractive and suggestive, but stopped short of pornographic. They walked a careful line between morale enhancement and military propriety. Different theaters of war developed different standards. European theater commanders tended to be more permissive, perhaps because the horrific casualties made psychological considerations paramount. Pacific theater nose art often featured more aggressive imagery, demons and skulls rather than pin-up girls, reflecting the particularly brutal nature of combat against Japan. What did all this sanctioned rule-breaking actually produce? You're about to find out. And the artistic quality was far more impressive than anyone expected. The quality of nose art varied enormously across thousands of aircraft. Some was crude, painted by enthusiastic amateurs with more passion than technique. Uneven lines, disproportionate figures, colors that clashed or faded quickly. But much of it was genuinely sophisticated artwork created by trained commercial artists who'd been drafted into military service and discovered unexpected opportunities for their skills. Tony Starcer had worked as a commercial illustrator in New York before the war. He'd trained at prestigious art schools, created magazine advertisements, developed professional techniques. Suddenly, he found himself painting on aluminum fuselages in freezing English weather. The medium presented unique challenges. You couldn't make mistakes easily because paint was scarce and aircraft were constantly needed for missions. Work had to be completed quickly, often overnight. The paint had to withstand extreme weather conditions, temperature variations from ground level to high altitude, wind stress at high speeds. The pin-up girls were typically inspired by contemporary magazine artwork. Alberto Vargas and George Petty created the most famous pin-up art for Esquire magazine, and their distinctive style influenced countless nose art renditions. Crews would bring magazine clippings and request that artists recreate or modify specific images. Memphis Belle's nose art was directly inspired by Petty's work. Other famous bombers featured variations on similar themes. Beyond pin-up girls, cartoon characters appeared frequently. Disney had licensed certain characters for military use, so Donald Duck, Bugs Bunny, and other recognizable figures adorned many aircraft. These provided a different psychological function than pin-up girls. The cartoons emphasized humor and innocence, a deliberate contrast with the deadly serious business of strategic bombing. The juxtaposition was psychologically important, maintaining connection to normal peacetime culture even in the midst of industrial-scale violence. Fighter aircraft presented different artistic challenges. The smaller surface area required simpler, bolder designs. P-51 Mustang pilots often painted shark teeth on engine cowlings, a tradition borrowed from the famous Flying Tigers in China. P-47 Thunderbolts featured playing cards, dice, horseshoes, and other luck-related imagery. The artwork had to be instantly recognizable during split-second combat encounters. The actual painting process was remarkably labor-intensive given the circumstances. Artists worked in impossible conditions, freezing temperatures in England where hands would barely function, scorching heat in North Africa and the Pacific, always under severe time pressure because aircraft were constantly being prepared for the next mission, repaired from battle damage, or reassigned to different crews. Artists developed efficient techniques. They used chalk to sketch designs directly on fuselage metal. They mixed paints to achieve colors that would remain visible and vibrant. They worked from ladders and scaffolding, often at night by inadequate lighting. The best nose art artists became highly valued and sought after, with crews competing for their attention. But was this elaborate artistic tradition universal? Keep going. We're about to confront shocking differences between different theaters and air forces. Nose art culture varied dramatically between different theaters of war and different national air forces. These variations reveal fascinating insights about cultural differences, operational realities, and varying military cultures. In the European theater, nose art reached its most elaborate development on heavy bombers. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators had large fuselages providing excellent canvases. The artwork was predominantly pin-up girls, cartoon characters, and aggressive names designed to boost morale. These bombers flew daylight missions deep into Germany, enduring horrific casualties from Flak and Luftwaffe fighters. The nose art served as psychological armor against sustained terror. The Pacific Theater developed distinctly different characteristics. American aircraft faced different enemies and operated in different cultural contexts. Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as demons and monsters, so American nose art deliberately played into these characterizations. Aircraft were painted with skulls, grim reapers, devils, and other frightening imagery. The message was clear and deliberate. We are exactly the monsters you fear. The most iconic Pacific nose art appeared on P-40 Warhawks flown by the Flying Tigers in China. The distinctive shark teeth painted on engine cowlings became immediately recognizable worldwide. This design was actually borrowed from RAF aircraft in North Africa, but the Flying Tigers made it famous. The shark mouth was aggressive, primal, perfectly suited to the P-40's profile. It transformed fighters into predators. British nose art was notably more restrained than American. Royal Air Force regulations were stricter, and British cultural attitudes toward public displays of sexuality were more conservative. British aircraft featured squadron badges, individual aircraft identification letters, and occasional cartoon characters, but rarely the provocative pin-up girls that dominated American bombers. This reflected broader cultural differences between American and British societies and their respective military cultures. Soviet nose art was virtually non-existent. Soviet military culture emphasized collective identity over individual expression. Aircraft belonged to the state and the people collectively, not to individual pilots or crews. Personal decorations were actively discouraged. The few Soviet aircraft that did receive nose art typically displayed political slogans, patriotic imagery, or tributes to Soviet heroes rather than personal symbols or pin-up girls. German nose art existed but followed different conventions. Luftwaffe aircraft featured unit insignia and occasionally personal symbols, but rarely the elaborate artwork common on American aircraft. German military culture emphasized professionalism and discipline over personal expression. Some German fighters did feature shark mouths or other aggressive designs, particularly in the Mediterranean theater. But the practice never became as widespread as among Allied forces. These differences weren't merely aesthetic. They reflected fundamental differences in military culture, attitudes toward individual expression, and psychological approaches to sustaining morale under combat stress. How did this artistic expression function as actual psychological warfare? You're about to find out, and the deliberate intimidation tactics were more sophisticated than anyone imagined. Nose art wasn't just about friendly crew morale. It functioned as psychological warfare against enemy forces. The images sent deliberate messages designed to intimidate opponents and boost the morale of friendly ground forces. For Allied ground troops, particularly infantry slogging through Europe or island hopping across the Pacific, seeing bomber formations overhead with distinctive nose art provided powerful psychological encouragement. The personalized aircraft reminded ground forces that the air war wasn't just faceless industrial machinery operated by distant bureaucrats. It was being fought by individual men with personalities, humor, and humanity. The nose art made the air support feel personal and immediate. For enemy forces, the artwork was designed to intimidate and demoralize. German and Japanese soldiers and pilots saw American aircraft decorated with aggressive imagery, sexual imagery, cartoon violence, and defiant names. The psychological message was deliberate and calculated. These Americans are so confident of victory that they treat war like entertainment. They're not afraid. They're decorating their weapons like toys because they're certain they'll win. German intelligence services collected photographs of American nose art and analyzed the images for intelligence value. Luftwaffe reports attempted to extract information about American morale, unit identification, and psychological state from the artwork. Their conclusions consistently indicated that widespread elaborate nose art reflected high morale and strong unit cohesion. This intelligence assessment was essentially accurate. The most psychologically effective nose art combined multiple elements simultaneously. Personalization created crew cohesion. Aggression communicated confidence and power. Humor demonstrated psychological resilience. Sexuality reminded everyone what they were fighting to return to. The best nose art achieved all these functions simultaneously in a single integrated image. Memphis Belle perfectly exemplified this multi-layered effectiveness. The name was deeply personal, honoring Robert Morgan's girlfriend. The pin-up girl artwork was attractive and memorable. The overall package communicated confidence, humanity, and determination. The bomber became perhaps the most famous aircraft of the entire war, completing its 25-mission tour and returning to America for a morale-boosting tour that raised millions in war bonds. The nose art was inseparable from the legend. So what was the actual measurable impact? Hang in there. We're about to reveal statistics that prove this wasn't just feel-good decoration. Did nose art actually improve combat effectiveness and survival rates? The statistical evidence is complex, but the psychological evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Statistically, there's no direct proof that aircraft with elaborate nose art survived longer than aircraft without it. Survival depended on numerous factors: mechanical reliability, crew skill and experience, mission profiles, enemy opposition strength, weather conditions, and substantial random chance. The paint on a fuselage didn't deflect bullets, prevent mechanical failures, or improve engine performance. But the psychological impacts were measurable through various indicators. Crews on aircraft with distinctive, meaningful nose art consistently reported higher morale in surveys and debriefings. They felt more emotionally connected to their aircraft. They maintained their equipment more carefully and devotedly. They flew with greater confidence and took more pride in their missions. After-action reports and commander assessments consistently noted that crews with strong aircraft identification, usually centered on distinctive nose art and naming, performed better under extreme stress. A research study conducted by Army Air Force psychologists in 1944 examined the correlation between nose art and mission performance. The study found that bomber crews who had named and elaborately decorated their aircraft had marginally but consistently better mission completion rates and reported lower levels of debilitating combat stress. Captain James Stewart, the Hollywood actor who flew B-24 Liberators as a bomber pilot and squadron commander, observed these psychological dynamics firsthand. The bombers with the most elaborate, carefully maintained nose art invariably had the strongest crew cohesion and best performance records. Whether the nose art directly caused superior performance or was simply a symptom of crews that were already functioning well together, the correlation was obvious and consistent. The most telling evidence came from what happened when crews lost their aircraft. When a beloved bomber was shot down, severely damaged beyond repair, or simply worn out and retired from service, crews experienced genuine grief that went far beyond practical concerns about equipment replacement. They mourned the loss personally. The nose art had made that loss emotionally devastating in ways that purely mechanical equipment wouldn't have been. Veterans decades after the war could still describe their aircraft's nose art in precise, loving detail. They remembered the names, the images, the colors, the positioning. They felt emotional connections to machines they'd flown 70 or 80 years earlier. This lasting emotional impact demonstrates the profound psychological significance nose art held for the men who depended on it. But there's one more twist in this story. Stay with me. We're about to reveal what happened after victory and why these paintings became both celebrated and controversial. The post-war treatment of nose art reveals much about changing cultural attitudes, the evolving mythology of World War II, and shifting standards about appropriate military imagery. Immediately following victory in 1945, nose art was universally celebrated. It appeared prominently in magazine articles, newsreel footage, books chronicling the air war, and public exhibitions. The images were seen as wholesome expressions of American fighting spirit and creativity. The pin-up girls were patriotic rather than pornographic. The aggressive imagery was justified by righteous cause. America had won the war, and nose art had been part of that glorious victory. But attitudes shifted substantially over subsequent decades. By the 1960s and 1970s, as cultural attitudes toward gender and sexuality evolved through feminist movements and changing social norms, some nose art began to be viewed as problematic. The pin-up girls that seemed harmless or even patriotic in the 1940s looked sexist and objectifying through the lens of 1970s feminism. Museums struggled with how to handle these artifacts. Should they preserve complete historical accuracy, including potentially offensive imagery, or should they remove artwork that might offend contemporary sensibilities and visitors? The controversy intensified within active military services. By the 1980s and 1990s, sexual harassment policies and changing gender dynamics in increasingly integrated military forces made traditional nose art traditions genuinely controversial. Women were serving in air forces in substantial and increasing numbers. The pin-up girl nose art that had been standard and unquestioned in World War II was now seen by many as creating hostile work environments and reinforcing gender stereotypes incompatible with professional military culture. Modern military aircraft still occasionally feature nose art, but it's dramatically different from World War II traditions. Contemporary nose art must be approved through official channels, meet strict standards regarding appropriate imagery and messaging, and conform to regulations about respectful workplace environments. The sexually suggestive pin-up girls that dominated World War II bombers are essentially forbidden in modern American military aviation. Yet, World War II nose art remains culturally powerful and historically significant. Museums displaying restored vintage aircraft almost universally preserve original nose art as important historical artifacts. Restored vintage aircraft flying in air shows maintain their authentic wartime decorations. The artwork is recognized as legitimate cultural history, regardless of contemporary controversies about the imagery. This creates ongoing tensions. Aviation historians and veterans organizations argue for preserving complete historical accuracy, including nose art that might make contemporary viewers uncomfortable. Critics argue that displaying sexually objectifying imagery, even historical imagery, is inappropriate in educational settings where children and diverse audiences are present. The debates continue without clear resolution, reflecting broader cultural struggles about how to handle historical artifacts that don't conform to contemporary values and standards. Are you ready for the final revelation? Don't miss this. We're about to tie together what this phenomenon reveals about human psychology under existential threat. The broader lessons of World War II nose art demonstrate fundamental principles about how human beings maintain psychological resilience under sustained existential threat. First, the phenomenon proved that personalization is absolutely crucial for psychological survival in mechanized, industrialized warfare. Modern warfare is inherently depersonalizing. Individuals become statistics in strategic calculations. Equipment becomes interchangeable parts in massive logistical systems. In this dehumanizing environment, humans desperately create personal meaning wherever possible. Nose art was one crucial way aircrews maintained their humanity and individual identity in circumstances specifically designed to eliminate both. Second, nose art demonstrated that military effectiveness isn't determined purely by technical capabilities and tactical doctrine. Morale matters profoundly. Psychological factors directly influence operational performance. A crew that feels emotionally connected to their aircraft, that has meaningful rituals and even irrational superstitions, that has created personal significance around their service, consistently performs better under extreme stress than crews who view their service as purely mechanical obligation devoid of personal meaning. Third, the nose art phenomenon validated the importance of allowing military personnel substantial personal expression even within strict hierarchical military systems. The commanders who permitted and actively encouraged nose art despite official regulations recognized that military discipline and personal expression aren't necessarily contradictory. The most effective units balanced necessary regulation with appropriate flexibility that acknowledged human psychological needs. Colonel Frank Armstrong, who commanded multiple bomb groups in England, articulated this understanding in post-war memoirs. He could have strictly enforced regulations and prevented unauthorized nose art entirely, but doing so would have damaged crew morale for no operational benefit whatsoever. His mission wasn't enforcing every peacetime regulation. His mission was destroying German strategic targets and bringing his men home alive. Nose art demonstrably helped accomplish that mission. Therefore, nose art was tactically sound, regardless of what regulations said. The transformation represented by nose art went far beyond simple decoration or morale building. It was fundamentally about maintaining humanity in circumstances specifically designed to destroy it. Every pin-up girl, every cartoon character, every fierce name painted on a bomber was an assertion of individual identity against the grinding machinery of industrial warfare that sought to reduce humans to interchangeable components. The young men who flew these aircraft were facing statistical near certainty of death or crippling injury. They painted their bombers not from frivolity or boredom, but from desperate psychological need. They needed to create meaning in meaningless circumstances. They needed to maintain identity when everything conspired to eliminate it. They needed to exercise some tiny measure of control in situations where they controlled almost nothing about their survival. The legacy of World War II nose art extends far beyond the aircraft themselves and the specific images painted on aluminum fuselages. It represents a broader truth about human behavior under extreme sustained stress. When faced with overwhelming existential threat, humans instinctively create rituals, symbols, and personal meanings. These psychological strategies are as essential for survival as technical skills, physical equipment, or tactical doctrine. The aircraft that these young men decorated with pin-up girls, cartoon characters, and fierce names were instruments of industrial-scale violence. Strategic bombers designed to destroy cities and kill tens of thousands. But the nose art humanized them. It reminded everyone, crew members and observers alike, that these machines were operated by individual human beings with hopes, fears, humor, loves, and full humanity. The story of World War II Noah's Ark demonstrates that even in the most mechanized, industrialized, depersonalized forms of warfare imaginable, the human element remains absolutely central. Military effectiveness ultimately depends not just on technology and tactics, but fundamentally on the psychological resilience of the human beings who fight. And sometimes that resilience comes from something as simple as paint on aluminum, transforming anonymous equipment into something personal, meaningful, and worth fighting to bring home safely. If this story of art, psychology, superstition, and survival captivated you, hit that subscribe button now for more untold stories from history's greatest conflicts. Don't miss out on the next revelation.